This past week was our annual diocesan clergy conference, and the following sermon was written by our new bishop, the Right Reverend Phil LaBelle, and he asked that we share it with all of you. Imagine Peter's surprise when Jesus, who had been teaching the people near the lake, simply climbed into his boat and asked him to push out a bit into the water. After working all night long with nothing to show for it, Peter had been washing his nets, pulling out the seaweed, branches, debris. The gathering of people kept pushing up against Jesus to hear his words more closely. And amidst all the jostling, he kept getting closer and closer to the water's edge. The boat was the best available option. I hope that this slightly amused Peter, rather than annoyed him, that this teacher, this rabbi, would have the chutzpah to climb into his boat without asking. After Peter pushes the boat out, Jesus continues teaching. And Peter is now a captive audience, which might have been Jesus' intention all along. Peter likely had more work to do on the boat, things to wipe down, ropes to coil, but he would certainly be listening to Jesus' words. When he finishes teaching, Jesus turns his attention to Peter and tells him to head out into the deep water for a catch of fish. I can assure you that this caught Peter off guard. He was the professional fisherman, and Jesus, a rabbi. He probably gave Jesus the same look that your mechanic gives you when you try to explain what's wrong with your car, with accompanying noises. But something about Jesus, maybe his words or the way he just climbed into that boat, or simply the way he held Jesus' gaze, something caused Peter to look at this teacher and say, "Master, we have worked all night long and have caught nothing. But if you say so, I will let down the nets." He then points the boat toward that deeper water and sets out, eventually throwing out the nets he had just cleaned. And Luke writes, when they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. Pandemonium ensues. Fish flopping all over. The boat creaking under the strain and tilting heavily to one side. Peter signals to his partners, James and John, who are still on the shore, and they immediately head out to help. Once they get there and bring up the nets, the fish fill both boats up to capacity to the point where they begin to sink. That's when Peter regains his senses. He's probably been working in overdrive without really thinking, years of instinct kicking in. But in finally seeing the sinking boats and the multitude of fish, and this teacher still in the boat with him, he finally puts it all together. Peter is overwhelmed by it all. He falls down before Jesus and says, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." And Jesus looks down at him with compassion. "Don't be afraid," he says. "From now on, you will be catching people." Nothing else is said. They head back to shore. And when they arrive, Peter gets out of the boat and leaves it all behind. The nets, his livelihood, and that unbelievable catch of fish, and simply follows Jesus. He has been caught. As a clergy person, I get asked from time to time to share the story of how I got called into ministry. I tell people about the paper I wrote back in school for Mrs. Sears about what I wanted to be when I grew up, and the summer I spent playing church, giving my parents Ritz crackers and grape juice. Every clergy person has just such a story in her back pocket. But the same isn't always true for the people who sit in the pews. If I were to ask someone at coffee hour to tell me how God called them, I suspect that at least some would be caught off guard. They might look at me a little amused, wondering what I was up to, just like Peter in the boat. Or perhaps they'd feel like they'd been out all night long, working hard, with nothing to show for it. And as one commentator put it, they're face to face with their limits and ready to give up. And at that point, when we've struggled and begun asking the questions if what we're doing is really worth it, Jesus enters our story and asks us to push out into deeper water. He invites us to lay aside our penchant for the predictable and the routine in order to venture into new ground or new depths. It's always an invitation from Jesus and not a demand. Always a way that can bring us to new places full of life if we just have the faith to trust and push out into deeper water. If we can just leave the presumed safety of the familiar behind. A church consultant I worked with years ago often asked the gathering of churches and religious groups that he helped if they would be willing to give sacrificially of all their lives for the greater good. Yes is often the resounding response. Absolutely. And many times there'd be a side note. Someone who said, my church never asks me to do this. People are willing, but they are not always invited. They might feel what could be described as a call, or maybe even a desire for a call, but where that leads is not always clear. It's so easy to understand why Peter wants Jesus to leave, isn't it? He's there in the boat with this unbelievably huge catch of fish, and he recognizes that Jesus is so much more than first imagined. How can you measure up to someone like that? He's overwhelmed and scared and sees that he has little to offer. He's just a fisherman. Go away, Jesus. I can't be near you. I am a sinner. Don't be afraid, Jesus says. You might not think that you have what it takes. You might feel overwhelmed in my presence, but do not fear. Do not be overcome by that type of thinking. From now on, you will fish for people. Except he doesn't say fish, does he? He says catch. Although most translations of Luke, you'll read all out there, many still say fish. But when you pull out a creature that will likely end up on a dinner plate, that is fishing. But Luke uses the Greek word zogreo, which literally means catching live ones. The prefix coming from zoe, or life. Jesus wants Peter to catch people, but they will be full of life, not eaten up for dinner. The call Jesus gives is to bring people in as his followers so they too can participate in the life-giving work of his kingdom. Friends, clergy are not the only ones whom Jesus calls. He calls us all. Peter didn't think he had anything to offer, yet Jesus found him. He went to his workplace and called this one, without a seminary degree, to go out and catch people with God's love. I think most of us believe that we don't have much of anything to offer for Jesus' kingdom. Yet he simply says, don't be afraid. And he looks at us and continues, from now on, you will be catching people. Or if Peter were a doctor, Jesus would have said, from now on, you'll be healing the soul. Or if he were a mechanic, you'll be getting people back on the road to life. From now on, you'll be about the work of my kingdom. From now on, your life will be for a greater good. So what about us? Can we hear the call and give our lives for so much more? Can we take our place alongside those who have been found by Christ in order to change the world with his love? Can we leave everything behind? Our fears, insecurities, lack of faith in our own skills, our reluctance, our fondness for the routine. Can we leave it all and follow Jesus? As your new bishop, the bishop speaking, I have heard a resounding yes to that from many people I have spoken to, but there's an uncertainty as to how to do that. How to live as 21st century disciples. Part of it is because our church lives have begun to focus more on budgets and getting things done and finding people for leadership positions than on hearing anew the stories of our faith and what they might mean for us and how we might share that good news with others. We don't frequently discuss or take up spiritual practices that have shaped the lives of those who have followed Jesus on the way because we are too busy doing other things. Good things, mind you. Yet those tasks have become the focal points of our lives. The kinds of things that get more airtime at the vestry or the bishop's committee meetings. It's our way of cleaning the nets and wiping down the boat and whatnot. And Jesus looks around at all of that. He gets into the boat, enters our buildings, and says, go deeper. Push out from the status quo. There are people to be caught, a lot of them. So many it will start bursting the nets. But it takes moving out from the shallows. In April, I'm beginning a 3-year journey with our diocese focused on becoming contemplative disciples. I'll be sharing short teaching videos introducing a spiritual practice every other month and inviting you to engage with it, to spend time at leadership meetings talking about it, reading a Bible passage together, trying on a new way of going deeper in our faith. We'll have resources of things like articles and books and films to suggest, and provide a framework for small group gatherings. And we'll also discuss these at our governing body's meetings. This discipleship project will be 3 years because that was the length of time that the early church thought was necessary to prepare new converts for baptism. 3 years of study before you could get baptized in the old church, the earliest church. This is not a requirement, of course, it's an invitation for the people who make up our diocese to put out into deeper water and let down our nets, to venture out onto new ground. Don't be afraid, Jesus says to Peter in the boat, and he says it to us, Do not give in to fear. From now on, you will be catching people. The invitation is there. The question simply is, will we choose to leave everything behind and follow him? Or will we simply stay there at the dock?